Hi everybody, Joseph here with Bean to Bar World, and today I'm going to compare cocoa beans and chocolate and cacao products to peanuts, peanut butter, and peanut products. So why do I want to make this comparison? Well, a lot of people don't understand where chocolate comes from. What is chocolate? What are cocoa beans? What are cocoa nibs? What is cocoa powder? A lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people think sometimes chocolate and coffee are from the same plant. And so what I wanted to do today is compare other products that most people are more familiar with and compare them to cacao and chocolate products to help better understand cacao and chocolate. Now, I do want to point out that I know peanuts are not botanically exactly the same as cocoa beans. Cocoa beans are the seed of a fruit that grows on a tree. Peanuts are a legume. They're called peanuts because they're a very fatty legume. And so over time, people associate them with nuts, but they're more closely related to lentils and chickpeas and beans than they are to cashews and almonds and cocoa beans. But they're essentially both seeds of a plant. Now, cocoa beans come from this. This is a replica of a real cocoa pod. And if I open up a cocoa pod fruit, what you have inside is the white, maybe off-white, fleshy fruit of the cacao. And it's made up of many segments all around. Each segment is a seed that we call a cocoa bean. Cocoa bean is the seed of this. And it's surrounded by the fleshy fruit. Now, the fruit can be eaten, but most of the time nowadays, it's grown so that we can have the seeds. Most cacao is grown not for the fruit, but for the seeds to make chocolate. So we have two seeds of different plants. We have the cocoa beans. So I have some cocoa beans here. And cocoa beans are the seed of the cacao. We call them beans, but they're not beans as a legume, right? There's a lot of confusion sometimes. So peanuts are not nuts, cocoa beans are not beans, they're not legumes. These are seeds that grow on a tree. These are seeds that grow on the ground like a legume. But cocoa beans are like many other seeds of many plants, almonds, sesame seeds, cashews, pecans, they're very fatty. Okay, so cocoa nibs, my spoon here, there's a little pile of nibs, which is essentially just the kernel of the seed. So the cocoa bean has a very thin paper-like shell around it. Some people call it the husk. It's the testa of the seed. That's removed. And the kernel is what we call cocoa nibs. And this is what people can eat. So it's very crunchy, has some essence of cocoa in there. It's a bit tart as well because of the fermentation process. But if you have a good quality cocoa bean, it's going to be pretty tasty. Now here I have some peanuts. Now these are very similar. If these were not roasted, if they were still fresh from the plant, these would grow into little peanut plants. In the same way, these seeds, if fresh and still alive, would grow into a cacao tree. So similar, right? Similar purpose. They're both seeds. Peanuts, also crunchy, very distinct flavor, not deep as intense as the flavor of cocoa beans. Now both of these can be ground up into a paste, right? They're both very fatty seeds. This is a very fatty legume. This is a very fatty seed. They can be ground up. The cell walls of the seed break apart. The fat is released. The friction kind of heats up the fat and it liquefies and you have a paste. So peanut butter is ground up peanuts, as most of you know. Now, the peanut butter can be just roasted peanuts ground up into a paste. A lot of peanut butter also has sugar added as well. I'm not going to talk about commercial peanut butter, which has palm kernel oil. We're just going to keep it a bit simple. This here is just pure ground up peanuts. That's peanut butter. We can add a little bit of sugar, sweeten it up, grind it up together. It's still peanut butter. Now what happens when you grind up cocoa nibs? You get chocolate. Chocolate is essentially the equivalent of peanut butter. It's the peanut butter of cocoa beans. It's the seeds of the cocoa bean ground up into a paste. It doesn't have to have sugar, right? There's 100% chocolate bars. Most of it does, but whether you add a little bit of sugar or not, it's ground up into a fluid. It's refined a bit longer. It's not exactly the same process as peanut butter, but from an ingredient point of view, from a product point of view, it's essentially the same thing. It's fat released, and then in the case of chocolate, it's formed into a chocolate bar. Now that brings us to the fat of the cacao, which is very, very important. It's very distinct, it's very unique. So the products here I have is, on this side I have cocoa butter, which is the fat squeezed from the cocoa bean. And on this side I have liquid peanut oil, which is fat squeezed from the peanut. These are both simply just oils, fats, squeezed from these seeds. Now, peanut oil is liquid at room temperature. Cocoa bean oil is solid at room temperature, okay? A lot of people think because of the word butter in there that it's associated with dairy. If you see that on the ingredients, cocoa butter, nothing to do with dairy or cows or anything like that. It's just what they call the oil pressed from the cocoa bean. Now, these here can be added into these products. A lot of peanut butter manufacturers add a little bit extra peanut oil. Same with chocolate. A lot of chocolate makers, you don't have to. You can add a little bit extra cocoa butter, and that makes the chocolate, when it's liquid, when it's in liquid form, when it's molten, more fluid, easier to cast into molds, which is why a lot of manufacturers add the extra cocoa butter, because if you just grind up cocoa beans and sugar, it's really, really thick, okay? And same with peanut. Peanut butter is really, really thick. Adding a bit of peanut oil makes it a bit more fluid as well. Now, the reason why we have cocoa butter goes back to the 19th century because the Dutch invented cocoa powder, which is why we have cocoa butter. Now, in the Americas, the South Americans, the Mesoamericans, when they were eating chocolate, when they were making chocolate, it was a drink. Chocolate was essentially a drink, more like coffee or tea than anything else. And when the Europeans brought it to Europe, they would continue consuming this drink. But the way they would make it maybe changed a bit from the way they did in the Americas, and they would boil this. They would boil the ground up cocoa beans with water and other ingredients. And what happens when you boil fatty substances in water, right? Think of when you're making a stock and you're putting whole chickens and chicken bones in there. The fat starts to float to the top. And so when they were boiling this concoction in Europe, they had all this fat from the cocoa beans, essentially the cocoa butter, float to the top of their pots, and they would have to skim it out in order to have the nice chocolate drink that they wanted. And it was a lot of work. So in 1828, the Dutch, Van Houten, invented a cocoa press. And what this did is it squeezed not all, but most of the fat out of the cocoa beans. And so what was left over was this big, thick, hard block. Today we call it a cocoa press cake, which is essentially just pressed cocoa nibs with the most of the fat removed. And then that gets cracked up and beaten down into a powder, pulverized into a powder, and you have your cocoa powder. So here is just some cocoa powder, which essentially is the same constituents as the cocoa nib, but with a lot of the fat removed. This is a 20% fat cocoa powder. So about 30% or so was removed. There's even 10%, there's different percentages of cocoa powder that can be produced. Now, with peanuts, this is why I chose peanuts as opposed to other nuts, is you get a much more wide range of products from peanuts today in the grocery stores than you do from other nuts. And nowadays, you can also find peanut powder, which is essentially peanuts with most of the fat squeezed out. And so you have mostly carbohydrates and whatever's inside the peanut that's not the fat left over. Now, this is not pure peanut powder. This is also ground up with some cane sugar and a little bit of salt. It was not very easy to me to find pure peanut powder as I can pure cocoa powder, but it's essentially the same thing. We have, look at it this way, we have the seeds, a fatty seed, one is a legume, one is a seed. We have the fatty seeds of plants, which if they were alive would grow into new plants. They can be roasted, ground up. In the case of peanut, turned into peanut butter. In the case of cocoa beans, turned into chocolate. They could have some sugar. They could not have some sugar. That doesn't change the product. It's still chocolate ground up cocoa nibs as chocolate, and ground up peanuts as peanut butter. Now we can also press the fat out of these peanuts and have peanut oil and peanut powder. We can press the fat out of the cocoa beans and have cocoa butter and cocoa powder. So now you have a good overview of how these products compare to products you're more familiar with. So when you're eating a chocolate bar, think of it as eating peanut butter. Now the reason why they're so different, why you have a bar of chocolate and not a bar of peanut, is because of the properties of the oils, of the fats, okay? Cocoa butter is very, very unique. Not just that it's solid at room temperature, but that it's not too oily, not too greasy, that it melts at body temperature. Two reasons why we love chocolate. One is the flavor. Two is the fat. A lot of people will say white chocolate is not chocolate. For trade reasons, there's some truth to that, but it is still chocolate. It's not the same caliber as dark chocolate, milk chocolate, especially if you're talking about fine chocolate, because you don't need really good cacao to make really good white chocolate. White chocolate essentially is simply the fat of the cocoa bean mixed with usually milk powder and sugar, and then some other flavors, vanilla, whatever else you want to add. That's essentially white chocolate. Think of it sort of like an egg white omelet. It's still an omelet and it's still made of egg, but it's only made of half the egg. White chocolate is only made from the fat, whereas dark chocolate and milk chocolate are made from the whole cocoa nib. Dark chocolate essentially is just the cocoa nib ground up into a paste, usually with a little bit of sugar added. Milk chocolate is the exact same thing, but with milk powder and sugar added to the cocoa nib, ground up into a paste. And we can do what we call tempering. I'm not going to go too much into detail now, but you can temper the fat of cocoa butter to crystallize into different ways. So there's 6 polymorphs of the fat. And so the fat of cocoa butter, the fat contained in chocolate, the way you cool it, the way you let it set, allows the crystals of the fat to crystallize differently. And so that's why you can have chocolate that's sort of whitish and crumbly and mottled. That's untempered chocolate, or chocolate that went out of temper, or chocolate that was never tempered, or chocolate that was poorly tempered. Chocolate that's tempered properly, which means it's cooled down in a way to build the proper crystal form, is what we call tempered chocolate, is usually very homogeneous in color, shiny, dark. That's what we want. That's what we can do with cocoa butter. We can't do that with peanut oil. We can't do that with any other fats, unless there may be synthetic fats. There's some cocoa butter replacers that are synthetic fats that were created to replicate the properties of cocoa butter. These are not fats that are naturally found in nature. And that's something I'll talk about another day as well. So hopefully this comparison has opened your eyes a little bit to what the different chocolate and cacao products are, how they compare to other foods we're more familiar with, right? A lot of people eat peanuts, peanut butter, peanut oil, right? And so we can understand now how that compares to cacao, chocolate, and cocoa butter. So again, cocoa beans, you have your fruit, you have your cocoa pod. Inside the fruit are the seeds, which we call cocoa beans. Inside the seed, if you remove the thin testa, is the cocoa nib. That's what we grind up and turn into chocolate. So chocolate is ground up cocoa nibs with or without sugar. These cocoa nibs can then be pressed to create the fat, cocoa butter, have that isolated, and then whatever is left over is pulverized into a powder called cocoa powder. Okay? And there's another video I talk about cocoa powder. If you go a little bit back, you'll see that there's a video where I talk about types of cocoa powder, alkalized, non-alkalized, but I won't go into that today. Now, cocoa beans can be used just like peanuts. We can add them on cereal, on oatmeal. We can eat them as is, although they're a bit intense for some people. You can treat the cocoa nib like you would any other nut. You can add them to your cookies. You can, whatever you add nuts with, you can use cocoa nibs essentially. And just like we use peanut butter to make peanut butter cookies, we incorporate into a lot of other recipes, you too can melt down chocolate and use that in the same way. You don't always have to add cocoa powder to your recipes, depending on the recipe. You know, if it's a sponge cake, you don't want a lot of fat in there sometimes, so you probably be adding cocoa powder instead of chocolate. But you can make cookies with melted chocolate replacing the peanut butter. You might have to adjust for the recipe, but you can do that, mixing in the eggs and the butter and the flour and making some really delicious cookies. So in many ways, chocolate and peanut butter can be used in similar ways. You can make a drink out of this chocolate, just like you can make a drink out of peanut. The fats as well, cocoa butter, we can use in cooking. We can incorporate it back into the chocolate. Peanut oil, we can use in cooking. We can incorporate it back into the peanut butter to change the consistency. And then we have the powders. Cocoa powder can be used to make drinks, can be used in baking, can be used to roll chocolates and truffles with on the outside. Then we have peanut powder, which, is a bit more of a new product on the market, especially in North America. But that can be used in similar ways as cocoa powder in many different recipes. We can use it in drinks and smoothies. So hopefully this comparison has helped you understand chocolate and cocoa beans a little bit more, gave you a little bit perspective of what these products are. Understand as well, right? Peanuts, other nuts, I could have used almonds or cashews if I found almond or cashew powder. But, these are healthy ingredients. Peanuts, peanut butter, peanut oil. When used properly, when consumed properly, in moderation, there's nothing wrong with these. A lot of people associate chocolate with sugar and preservatives and all this sorts of stuff, and that's not always the case. It doesn't have to be. Chocolate can be very healthy. Cocoa beans, cocoa nibs, very healthy, really high in antioxidants, have minerals as well. Chocolate, dark chocolate made from that carries on a lot of those qualities as well. Cocoa powder has some, especially if it's not alkalized, also has antioxidants and minerals. And cocoa butter can even be used on your skin. A lot of skincare products contain cocoa butter because it's not too greasy or oily. Be careful about using it on your fat. If you have sensitive skin, it might clog your pores a little bit more. But there are some creams and balms that people use where it incorporates cocoa butter. So I hope you learned a lot today. And if you have any other questions about cacao and chocolate, please feel free to reach out to me. Visit my website, beantobarworld.com. And if you go to the free learning center, you'll see tons of information on the history, the process, all sorts of things about chocolate. And I hope to meet with you again soon. Download the free Bean to Bar app to connect with incredible chocolate makers from around the world. Also be sure to visit beantobarworld.com, your portal for all things fine chocolate, virtual tastings, free learning resources, research, and much more. Subscribe to the newsletter to stay in touch and donate to the free app and free resources here. Contact me for any chocolate-related questions you may have.